Thinking about suicide and agnostic. Victory ain't for the Lord, but the opposite. Feeling like giving up. People care, but not enough. Down south, where I'm from, Tampa Bay, now Boston.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. This is Louise Carcione, and you are tuned in, about to listen to Mental Health in Your Neighborhood. I have a new guest this morning, someone that I have not met, so this should be a very interesting broadcast today. I do want to remind you that the reason for having the broadcast is because our minds, our bodies, and our spirits are connected. And because of that, everything in our environment is touched by those parts of our body, mind, and spirit, and help us to have mental health. So I do want to thank the engineers who are with me this morning as well. I believe it's Pastor Hobbs and my brother Eric Kennedy. Good morning, the two of you.
Good morning, Deacon.
Also, I do want to, has the guest called in?
Yes.
She has, okay. Well, let me introduce Brashini Reece. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, yes, this is exciting because, as I said earlier on the broadcast, I've never met you before. I've not seen you before. And this is a very interesting opportunity for us to be talking about something that is very, I have a new guest, very important, and that is prison reform.
Yes.
Yes. So do you want to tell me something about your interest in prison?
Absolutely. First, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you. It's a beautiful sunny morning here in Boston, and I'm feeling blessed. So thank you. In terms of prison reform, my interest, so I am a survivor of violence. I hold a doctorate in forensic psychology, and I'm a restorative justice practitioner and prison reform advocate. That sort of sums me up, I guess you could say, but I have a lot of life experience and academic experience in terms of the issue of mass incarceration in our country.
Okay. And have you had any experience with the prison system in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts?
Yes, I was a volunteer in the prison system for about 4 years doing restorative justice work in Massachusetts.
Okay. And could you tell me what your concerns are related to what is going on that that either helps those who are incarcerated or does not help those who are incarcerated?
Yes, absolutely. So I would start by saying that I think that my primary concern is that the general public has a perception of what prison is supposed to be. If you poll the American population, more than half of Americans believe that prison should be rehabilitative. And there is a perception that somebody goes to prison for something that they've done and that they should come out a changed person after that, and that there should be a process that a person goes through. And so my first goal in life every day is to educate somebody in our country about prison who's never been impacted by it in any way, to help them understand that what we perceive in our country as what should be incarceration or the reasons for incarceration or what happens is very far, in fact, the opposite of what actually happens behind the walls. And for many of the men and women, it feels like a black hole, that they are sentenced and then they are just dumped into this black hole and never seen again, because our country has a life sentencing problem, extreme sentencing and life without parole. So that's my passion, is really educating Americans who just don't have any experience at all, to help them understand that there's a huge disconnect between what we would want to happen if somebody needed to be removed from the community for something that they've done, a violent crime, and what actually happens.
Well, Brashini, I have to say that everything that you have just said is perfectly clear to me, because I have been promoting and talking about what you have just said over the broadcast for many years. And I'm very concerned because hundreds of people who are incarcerated write letters to me, to Massachusetts Cure, at the location where the studio is, at 670 Washington Street in Dorchester, Massachusetts. And many of them have told me about being mistreated rather than rehabilitated, so that they're able to understand what they need to be learning about while they're incarcerated, so that they can be, when they're released from prison, they would be able to understand how they need to take care of themselves, how they need to respond to the system that they have to relearn about once they're back out again, and so that they can avoid recidivism. But what has really happened in the Commonwealth is the opposite, and that is that people are put in solitary confinement for days, weeks, months, years, and rather than have anything that represents rehabilitative training or understanding of how they can do better for themselves, so that they don't have to come back to prison once they're released.
Correct. And that brings me to something else that I'm passionate about, to tie that sort of into the larger picture, is that justice in our country is not about accountability. Because what you're also pointing out is that for a person inside, they may not ever really have to face what it is that they've done, because there is no rehabilitative process, there is no transformation, there is no process in which a person has walked through the steps of accountability. So justice in our country is a time clock. That's literally what justice is. We put somebody in a cage, and then we just watch the time pass. And so when people who've never encountered the justice system, when I talk to them about, well, what about the survivors? And there is a perception in our country that healing is found by incarceration, and that is a myth.
Yes.
Healing comes through accountability and doing repair and some sort of like paying back the debt to society in some sort of way. But putting somebody in a cage and saying that is justice, that's what happens in our country. But that's not my perception as a survivor of violence as what justice should be.
Right. I would like to speak about your your personal experience at some point, but I also want to have you reiterate what I have been saying all along, which is that rehabilitation does not take place. And what happens once the 80% of those who are incarcerated are released from prison, once they're released and they end up going to a place like the shelter, which the experience of living in a shelter is very much like being incarcerated, because you have to be there at a certain time or you don't get your bed to sleep in, and you have to do it you're told to do, and you have to be in the position in the location that you're supposed to be in. I mean, everything is very rigid, and they also do not understand how to use the cell phones and how to apply for work when they don't have identification.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're naming 2 or 3 of 1,000 barriers that person faces the moment that they do come home. It's really hard to describe to people what the experience of, a formerly incarcerated person when they come home. And of course, I'm not formally incarcerated, but I have worked with some individuals who have come home, and there is some similarities across their stories, no matter how much time they did, no matter what their crime was. And what you're pointing out is that there's just these barriers to employment, to housing, but there's also these intense barriers to reconnecting with family or loved ones or people that might support them. And in many instances, they don't have anybody. Or their family of origin is actually the reason that they ended up incarcerated in the first place.
Correct.
So it wouldn't be it wouldn't be a place you want to go back to and rely on.
Right. Right.
And so people come home, and then they're just really on their own. So not only are they physically on their own, but then emotionally they're on their own. And then psychologically, there's the scarlet letter of having been incarcerated and the trauma that comes with this feeling that everyone around you can somehow tell that you were in prison.
Right. And the other thing, too, is because I've been employed by the Commonwealth in the Department of Mental Health for 50 years, and I'm now retired. But about middle of the road there, I was doing some work in the prisons with lifers, and there was a number of people who were interested in being in my group because I expected some honesty and commitment from them to talk about what they needed to learn so that they could share with one another and they could do something about it. And prior to my arrival, there was another person who has since passed on who was from Boston, one of the, I'm trying to think of what department it was, but it was education was being offered to people who were incarcerated who were willing to get their education while they were incarcerated. And that was happening maybe 30, 40 years ago. Right. And no one knows about it because so many years ago, and it stopped happening. Mm-hmm. And it's sad. And it's sad because many of the people that end up in the shelter in Boston didn't originally come from Boston. But that's the only place they're able to go because there aren't other shelters that they can just show up at and be allowed to come in and sleep at and go out and try to find a job during the day. There are all kinds of negative things that are occurring in the city of Boston relevant to people who are in the shelter, who don't understand what happens when they explain that they don't know how to use this, they don't know how to use that, and people just think that they're joking with them. Mm-hmm. They just think it's a big joke. Mm-hmm. And so people are not gaining any experience that's positive.
Yeah, and many formerly incarcerated will say to me at some point in their first year that they're home, they'll say, maybe I belong in prison because I don't understand all of this.
Right, exactly, and it's really interesting because so many people lost touch with their families when either something occurred at the time of the crime or something occurred during the time that they were incarcerated when they were calling and charging the telephone call to their family, and their family reached a point where they said, I can't let you call me anymore because I can't afford to pay this bill because the Commonwealth charges more for the telephone calls than if you and I were calling each other long distance.
Yes, the phone industry in the prisons is an $84 billion industry. And so my fiance is actually serving life without parole sentence here in Massachusetts, but he's actually a case out of Rhode Island. And it costs us $100 a week to talk 4 times a day for 20 minutes.
I believe that, and that's part of the problem, and that's part of the reason why some families end up refusing to accept a call that comes in from their family member because they can't afford to pay the charge.
Right. And so there's a reallocation of resources that the general public hasn't thought of, because if you've never had to deal with these instances, you're thinking like, well, my tax dollars go to the prisons, there should be rehabilitation happening. But less than 2% of the Department of Corrections budget goes towards programming. Most of it goes towards weaponry and a variety of other, like, quote-unquote security, things, and salaries for correctional officers and the staff. So then when people come home, they're already impoverished, like, from the go when they get released. And so then they have to try to make a living. But also, to your point on the families, is that the individuals who are incarcerated, statistically speaking, come from our most marginalized populations. So the families themselves are also impoverished. So they are also likely to be both people who've experienced harm and people who've committed violence. So within the same family, and this happened in my family, within the same family, my uncle was incarcerated for most of my childhood for violence that he committed. But within my family, my aunt was a survivor of some pretty horrific violence that had happened. But my family was then shouldered with the financial cost of both his attorney, like he had a public defender and all of that, but there's still a lot of court expenses that people are not aware of unless you've gone through the court process. And then paying for his, phone calls and to support him while he was in prison, and my aunt who was traumatized, then it costs our family. So people don't understand that, like, when other privileged people say, like, oh, well, we're trying to help marginalized people by incarcerating these individuals that they have deemed as dangerous, you're actually tearing apart and destroying and not doing anything to fix the marginalized communities that are in your area. You're just further traumatizing and marginalizing them without actually addressing the root causes of any of it.
I know, and there's just so many people who have no relationships with people who are incarcerated, either relatives or friends or neighbors or just anyone they used to work with or whatever. But they have no interest in people who are doing the time, because I hear that little routine, if you've done the crime, you have to do the time.
God, I hate that. Yeah, that's so tough on crime era. It's so outdated. Yeah,
it is outdated, but people are still thinking that. And what I usually talk about on my broadcast is, well, that may be the case. However, do those of you who have absolutely no knowledge of what's going on in the prisons in our state understand that there are people who are unable to hire an attorney, were not able to get an attorney when they went to the court system, were not able to do anything. And by the way, do you realize that you're paying for their incarceration
Yes.
by the tax.
Yes.
By the taxes. You're paying
Right.
for it.
Yes. It costs, in the Commonwealth, it costs $70,893 per incarcerated person.
Yes. Now, I think that's incredible because at one time there was, it was way back when, something like 35,000, and now it's what, 70,000?
Yes, it's 70,000, but what's important about that 70,000 is then people say like, oh, well, that's a lot of money. Great, then they're being taken care of. So what are you complaining about? It's misleading because it's an inflation in terms of like what the resources are actually allocated for. So building new prisons, for instance, or installing intense security systems that are invasive for our loved ones, or overtime for correctional officers. There's a lot. You can look and see what it's actually spent on, and you'll find out that it's very little is actually spent on our loved ones in any way. Given that most people don't even know that hygiene products like basic soap and things like that are, are not available for our loved ones. They have to purchase them. Everything inside prison has a cost, and usually a very inflated cost. So then the people who are shouldering it are the families, and they're already impoverished.
I know it, and the term of the canteen is something that people don't understand either.
Yes.
Because I know that someone who is incarcerated may have $0 in their canteen, or some may have $10 in their canteen, but whatever amount they have may not be able to allow them to be able to provide themselves with food, with water. I remember there was a period of time where the Department of Correction, Norfolk, was having all of the water was running through the copper pipes, and it came out brown in color. And the department was purchasing water for the staff and for the correctional officers, but not for the prisoners.
Right.
There was. I'm laughing not because it's a joke, but because it's ludicrous to believe that when something was wrong with the plumbing system in a facility, that the staff was being supported with clean water to drink, but not the prisoners who were being kept there. Now, that's ridiculous, but that happened.
Right. And the reason we laugh is because you can't write this. You can't write this stuff. It's bigger than Hollywood. It's one of the things that drives me every day when I talk to people who don't know anything about prison is the look on their faces when they hear some of what is happening in our system, and the look of shock. And I've even had, many people have said to me, like, but that's got to be illegal. They can't do that. I laugh, right? And I'm not laughing, like you said, because I think it's funny. I'm laughing because just, again, that lack of awareness that if you haven't ever had to experience incarceration for any reason, if you haven't had it in your family, then you just don't know, and you assume that, well, these individuals did something and they're within a system and the system is going to take care of them. And that's part of what we're doing is breaking down those myths and those assumptions.
And going back to the extra charges for the telephone calls from that families were expected to pay for on the charges, that profit was given to the individual administrator in the facility, and some of them were just providing some kind of events to for their staff rather than for the people who were incarcerated.
Right. And so what you're talking about is the kickbacks. So
Right.
when people ask me about like the issue of privatized prisons in our country, which obviously is a horrific idea, and most Americans are pretty on board with the idea that privatized prisons is absolutely inhumane and horrific, literally making money off of incarcerated people. But
yeah, and they're also the corporations that do privatize prisons are in they made money on at the where's the they were in the I'm trying to think of the place that they made money. I'll come back to it.
Yeah, that's okay, because what I was going to say is that the issue of privatized prisons is very egregious, but it is only about 10% of the system itself.
Right.
So when I work to educate people about the system, I explain to them how what you're pointing out about the phone companies, for example, is an example of how our state and governments are they are working with private corporations, and there is an ecosystem that has been created in our state facilities. So it's a little bit of a red herring to just focus on private prisons, because when you take the phone companies, for instance, there's only 3 phone companies that provide phone calls to incarcerated systems here in the country. And so in Massachusetts, Securus is the private company. Mm-hmm. So all of our facilities get kickbacks from Securus for using their service. And Securus makes $84 billion on the incarcerated and their families. Mm-hmm. And so the prison itself is invested in keeping a corporate contract like Securus because of the kickbacks that they get and the services that they provide. But that is an ecosystem that runs deeper than the issue of private prisons.
Correct. And that's why it's so important to me for you to repeat something that I've already mentioned, because even though people know that I've never met you, I see your picture on the screen because I asked you to send a picture of yourself to me. Yes. But I have never met you before, and I am really impressed with all you're having to say, because what you're saying is something I know about, because it's true. It's truth. You are speaking truth. And isn't that something? And I also want to ask the engineers if anyone has called in, or are there any questions, or if we could stop for a moment and invite people to call in who might have a question to direct to Brashini directly.
Good morning, Sister Louise. This is Brother Eric. Mm-hmm. So I had we were talking about the services that were provided, in prisons, and so I put a comment on there, having firsthand knowledge of it, is that if you go on the DOC's website and you look at the menu that they put up of what they supposedly are feeding the inmates, that is totally not. It sounds glamorous. It sounds like, whoa, they're being fed really well and stuff, but it's not what they're being served.
Correct. Yes, well, we know that, and that's why it's important for us to be able to say it on our broadcast, so that someone listening to the broadcast might hear it and might say, now, wait a minute, what are they talking about? Let me call them and find out what they're talking about. Mm-hmm.
And I just want to thank Brashini for being on, and again, tearing off the eye holds and letting people see and hear exactly what's going on, and for other people to know that they're, especially those that are incarcerated, that can listen to the broadcast, and have them know that there are people who are fighting for them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's so important, because I talk about the money that's made by the the privatization. I call it lottery lane, but but it's money that's being made because one of the things that they require is that when they sign a contract with a particular state, we have a few in this state, but not a large number. And one of the things that they require is that, excuse me, the beds must be kept full 92% of the time.
Yes.
Now, so that means that someone that's eligible to be interviewed for a parole hearing, who could potentially earn a parole and be released, wouldn't be able to be released out of a privatized bed because they want to keep the beds full by 92%.
Right. And so when people ask about, well, how do we end mass incarceration? How do we address the problem? It's always that we have to tear down the economic structure that has been moved from the slavery times to modern day. You know, there was this really smooth transition from slavery to mass incarceration that is very well documented at this point, and very, you know, anyone can sort of look it up and find out the connections. But because what you're pointing out is that if we were to decarcerate at the rate that actually is in line with the research that is supported by all of the research we know about public safety, all of the research we know about what is actually rehabilitative and what is treatment, if we were to put those things in place and then decarcerate our population in accordance with science, then we would run into the problem of the economic structure that wants to stay in place, that will fight to stay in place. And of course for good reason, because in our country we are a capitalistic country. So the people who have jobs in the prisons often, you know, those are lucrative careers for them based on, like, you know, flexibility and their needs for their families and benefits and things like that. And so I grew up in poverty, and I'm white for the listeners who can't see me. So I understand that if my father had been given an opportunity to be a correctional officer, he probably would have taken it, because you know, he had a high school diploma, he was not college educated, he was a laborer, and that would have just fit into his skill set. He would have been able to do that job, and it would have paid him way more than any other, you know, job that he was working. And he would have been able to support his family, and maybe I wouldn't have grown up in poverty. And so those are powerful motives to keep a prison open, and we can turn a blind eye in our society to those things by just saying, like, well, they did something bad, so they shouldn't have done something bad. But it's really easy to get into trouble, very difficult to get out once you're in.
I know, and right now the prison industry is a major industry, because years ago, when CURE first was established in 1972, there were 300,000 inmates, but now there are like 2.2 million inmates. So there is
more
a
than
tremendous
2.3 million now. Yes,
is 2.3. Okay.
Yes,
so
yes.
I mean,
we keep going up.
Yeah, because it's an industry, and what you said about and what Eric said about the food, the recipe might be presented to someone about what kind of food is being given to those who are incarcerated, but that's not what is actually given to them that they're able to eat. It's something different. And so I know that one of the prophets, one of the organizations, I've forgotten which one it was, that made a profit on the collect call system was such that they were able to have a major cookout for all of their employees and their families, the employees, their families, and their children, to a place in New Hampshire for the day, for like a Saturday, for them to have a great day. And they were thanked by the Department of Correction for the work they had done. But that came out of the profit of those phone calls, and nothing was awarded to the inmates or their families who paid for it.
Right. The food is so bad. The food is so bad in the prisons that many incarcerated people that I know would rather go hungry. And you wouldn't feed the food. If we saw it here on the outside, you wouldn't feed it to your dog or your cat. You know, and a lot of it is processed, and some of this is actually coming to the attention now of the media, because over the last couple of months, actually, there was an article out of Maine that was talking about the poison, essentially, the lack of nutrition, the rotting food, the really dismal conditions in terms of culinary experience for the incarcerated. And I just want to quickly point out that for anyone who's listening to this and having a feeling of, well, this person has done something, and so then maybe there's a feeling of that they deserve it. One of the reasons mass incarceration is coming to the attention is because, according to a recent study in 2019, this is no longer a small percentage of Americans who are experiencing these conditions. We now have reached 50% of adults in America have a loved one who is either currently or formerly incarcerated. So this is no longer this tiny population that we can just continue to turn a blind eye to and pretend that they're invisible and they don't exist and we don't have to see them as human like we see ourselves. This is now an all of us problem, not just an us and them problem. And if you don't know somebody who has a loved one inside or has a loved one who has done time, then I would suggest that either you have friends who have not been able to be honest about it because of the stigma, or you are fortunate enough to find yourself in certain places in our society where incarceration is just not a reality. And that's a beautiful thing. I want all of us in this country to be able to say that. But the truth of the matter is like, that's not where we are.
That's certainly not. You're absolutely correct, because we're not even. We don't think about such things as the number of people who are in prison who don't belong there. There are some people who are sent to prison and they have not committed the crime.
Sure.
I mean, people don't even know that exists. And and to the degree that it does exist, there have been people who have been executed, who, in fact, years later, the Innocence Project made the determination that someone who was executed when they were young teenagers in prison were innocent of the crime. So they have been murdered by the community.
Yes.
Why?
Yes.
Why?
Well, because we look at justice in the opposite way here in this country. So when you have such a thing as the death penalty or life without parole sentencing, we call that the ceiling. So when you have a ceiling that is death, then all other sentences rise up to the ceiling. So then we're much more likely, statistically speaking, we're much more likely to have people inside that are innocent because of the number of people who are locked up, and they're more likely to be serving a life sentence, and they're even possibly, more likely to die in prison, whether or not they actually committed the crime. The issue itself is our extreme sentencing.
Right.
So instead of looking at it like, well, everybody should have a cap on their sentences, which in a way is humane and addresses the potential issue that maybe somebody didn't do it, but then we would still give them back their life after a certain number of years. Whereas if we lock everybody away for life or we execute them, that is something you can never give back to a person or their family.
Yeah, and there are just so many situations and conditions that are unknown to the community that's paying for it through their taxes, and without really understanding what is going on and without asking questions.
Right.
It's incredible, because I know so much about it when I receive these letters. I've been receiving letters from people who are incarcerated in other states, and for example, they were several of them will write in and they'll say, "I'm serving time in Colorado, but I was raised in Roxbury, Massachusetts, and someday when I'm released, I expect to come back to Roxbury, and I want to know what's going on in the prison system in Massachusetts." So they're writing to me to get information now while they're incarcerated. Is that interesting?
Definitely. But not uncommon. The resilience of the men and women inside is incredible.
I know.
Because I don't think I could survive what they endure, especially if I was sentenced to a life without parole sentence, which is ultimate psychological and emotional torture. You know, we put somebody in a cage and we say, by the way, you're going to be in this cage until you die. We don't know when that's going to be, but I hope you have fun waking up every morning and going to bed every night knowing that this is the place that you will die.
I just received a letter from someone who recently was incarcerated, and he said that that a flashlight was flashed into his face every hour while he was lying on his cot trying to sleep at night. Every hour.
Yes. So that's another common experience that the average American doesn't know, which is that they have this thing called counts, which of course you know, Louise.
Yeah.
And the count, of course, is to try to make sure that everybody is accounted for and that nobody has killed themselves, which is another common experience in prison. But it messes up the circadian rhythms of the incarcerated. So if you've done 15 years, or I mean, even 1 year, I challenge any ordinary person to set their alarm to be woken up once an hour or once every 2 hours in the middle of the night, and then see how you feel the next day. And when you have done that for years and years and years, most incarcerated people I know can't sleep through the night.
Right.
Even if they were to come home and have the softest bed and whatever, their sleep is completely decimated. But that's a common experience when you've done time.
Exactly. So there are so many things that you and I have talked about as we begin to identify our relationship to one another. We're going to, that we're talking about the same thing, because I spent 25 or 27 years going into the state prisons and conducting activities with individual groups of those who were incarcerated. And that was an experience for me, because I went in, I can remember going into Walpole and going through 11 different sliding steel doors to get to the actual place I sat and met with my group. I mean, just to get in to do that was amazing. And now that I'm retired, the Department of Correction doesn't allow me to come in and visit.
Right.
Isn't that interesting?
It's also very common. So the scariest weapons for the Department of Corrections is love, connection, community. And so the barriers that are in place, the average person might think, oh, those are for safety reasons or something like that. But I challenge that. It's actually, if we were to come together as community and see each other as humans and make connections, then we might tear down the economic structure that is the prison system.
Yes, that's
because
right.
then we see each other as brothers and sisters, then we see each other as one community and not this like us versus them tribalism. So the DOC wants the tribalism to continue. It's in their best interest for it to continue.
Right.
Yeah.
I know.
So you probably saw them as people, Louise.
I did. I certainly did. They were in my group, and I didn't have titles for them. They were people in my group, and that the other thing too is that that I've mentioned on my broadcast many times is now that the Department of Mental Health has closed all of its state hospitals, which was many years ago, a lot of people end up doing time who need to have treatment, mental health treatment, but they're not getting it. So they need medical treatment, they need mental health treatment, they need treatment for addiction, and they need treatment for coronavirus. And some of them are getting something and some of them are getting nothing.
Right, because the actual start of the rise of mass incarceration in our country started in the 1950s with the closure of the long-term mental health facilities.
Right.
And the promise was supposed to be that we closed down these very large-scale mental health hospitals, which had become ginormous. I mean, out of control. There was a hospital that I interned at my 5th year in my doctoral program, and at the height of the hospital, the population was 15,000 patients. It had its own zip code. So when the problem is that when that process started, the promise was to then reallocate the funds to the communities to put in housing, to put in treatment facilities, very small treatment programs within each of the communities to make it so that people who were struggling with mental illness, severe, major mental illness, were with their families and they were with their communities and they were embedded in our communities as they should be because they are our community members.
Right,
right. But the resources never got reallocated, so we closed the hospitals, but we didn't then put the fallbacks in place, the supports in place. So now these people, like you're pointing out, they end up, on the streets. They don't get any treatment. Maybe they commit a crime or they get picked up by the police because the police are our first responders for mental health emergencies, which is not acceptable and changing, luckily. But that was the start of mass incarceration in the 1950s is when it really all began, and it set the stage for what then followed in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s.
Right. I also want to ask Eric if he has another comment to make because we're getting close to the end of my broadcast.
Yes, actually I do. And you may have answered this already, but I'm multitasking here at the church, so I probably missed it. But I would like to know for Brashini, where do you get your drive and your passion from to do this work?
How much time you got? No, I'm just kidding. Like many things, it's rooted in childhood. I grew up in rural poverty, where I was surrounded by individuals who were impacted by systems but not helped by systems. My family experienced incarceration. Then, as a woman growing up, I myself became a survivor of violence at the hands of one of my romantic partners. So then I got my first lessons in the legal system firsthand. And there was no healing or accountability that was found through that process, and he was incarcerated. And so then I decided to go back to school, not really understanding that what was driving me was this passion. And when I found forensic psychology, I decided that, we should just tell the stories of the incarcerated. If you know the stories behind the violence, then of course we have to change what we do in the system because, then we see it as clear as day. And of course that was a very naive young person going back to school thinking, that's all it's going to take, right? So then my passion just grew and grew and grew and grew as I became more educated and I got more experiences in the community. And of course, my fiance being inside, I met him before we got together. We were co-facilitators together for restorative justice. And then we fell in love. And so my passion has continued to just like grow and grow and grow with every passing day. And this is my life's work. I consider ending life sentencing in this country to be my passion, my life's work.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I thank you for all the work that you do.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
I knew that Eric would have some comment to make. And we are getting close to the end of my time. How much more time do I have, Eric?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So I think, Brashini, what I would like you to do is to take about 3 minutes to say something you want to leave the listening audience with.
What I would want to leave with the audience is that justice is possible, that healing is possible, that we can do both holding people accountable and taking care of the violence that happens in our communities and change the prison system and the criminal justice system. We can do both. It's not a one or the other.
Aha. Very good. Thank you so much, Brashini. I'm so happy to have met you for the first time. I'm happy to have had you on my broadcast, and I would like to encourage you to be willing to come back on the broadcast another time.
Oh, of course. I would be honored, and I'm so humbled and grateful to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
You're entirely welcome. We'll talk about another program that I'm involved with, a doctoral program that I'm involved with at Boston University. But anyway, we'll talk another time. And next week, I believe that I will probably have as my co-host Pastor Bruce Wall. So I will see all of you or talk to all of you next week. And I want to thank Brashini for joining me today, for sharing and being honest about everything in her life that relates to how important it is to be involved with prison reform in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thanks again, Brashini. Thanks, Eric, for helping as well. And I know that I'm going to hear from people who haven't made the phone call. Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye. You too. Yes.